Hi, folks. Thanks for joining. I am trying to just add. Oh, yep. All right. Set the invite. We are waiting to have Eriel Deranger here. Good morning, everyone. I believe it's good morning. I am in, it's morning for most folks. I'm here in Glasgow, Scotland, where it is 5 p.m. And today we're here to discuss, or to break down rather, the Cop26, and I see Eriel. So I'm going to invite Eriel. Thanks for joining. Oh, did it work? All right. It's always a little bit of a moment to get this going. Hey, Eriel.
Hey, good morning. How are you?
I'm good. Good evening.
Oh yeah, I guess it's evening for you, but I'll be there shortly, so I'll be on the same time zone as you soon enough.
Yep. Yeah. Mind and body and spirit.
Mm-hmm.
Overseas. Well, this is great. I'm seeing folks join. Welcome, everybody. Today, me and Eriel are going to be discussing Cop26 and really just providing some insight into what I think, because of how many barriers exist in people being able to participate. There's a lot of confusion actually as to what COP is and why we participate. And in some cases, people are just learning about this this conference, which is a really important conference, especially for Indigenous and frontline communities who are experiencing impacts from climate change. So I know we have a limited time, Eriel, and I am really excited that you're able to join us during this crazy time. You're about to travel out here. So yeah, we'll just jump right into it. And I'll begin with a little bit of some intros. So I am Jade Begay. I'm the Climate Justice Campaign Director at NDN Collective. I'm Diné Antisuke Pueblo, based in Santa Fe, New Mexico, also known as Ogapo'oge. And as I mentioned, I'm calling in from Glasgow, Scotland, where both Eriel and I's team will be here really for about almost 3 weeks for Cop26, which is a part of the what is generally known as the UN climate talks. And I'll pass it over to you, Eriel, to introduce yourself.
Good morning, Planete. Dene Sotleneta, Eriel Ekwe Hushe, Duranje Vetsini Hasli. So good morning or good evening, good afternoon, wherever folks may be today. My name is Eriel Ekwe Duranje, and I'm a member of the Athabasca Chippewan First Nation, which is a Dene or Dene Sulene community in Treaty 8 territory of Northern Alberta. I'm also the Executive Director of Indigenous Climate Action, which is Canada's only Indigenous-led climate justice organization in so-called Canada. And I currently reside in Amiskwaciwâskahikan, also known as Treaty 6 territory, or Edmonton, Alberta. And I'm really excited to get ready to be going to COP and seeing some people I haven't seen for a really long time. But I do know that people don't really understand what this event is about. So I'm really excited to jump into this conversation a little bit here.
Awesome. Well, just let's start, with really the 101 and the basic question of what is the COP and where is it situated? The UN is a big thing, a big entity, a big bureaucracy.
Yeah, I think like
COP and how is it?
understanding the COP and how it functions. Oh, I don't know who's lagging, me or you, but one of us is having the jumpy internet moment here. I think the reality is the COP is a really big beast. So the COP, why do we even call it the COP? It's the Conference of the Parties. That's the official name under the UN. And it is under the UNFCCC or the UNFCCC, which is the UN Forum Convention on Climate Change. And the UN Forum Convention on Climate Change was created as part of the sort of an outcome that happened after a gathering in Rio de Janeiro in 1992. So in 1992, a group of, my son is being very loud, a group of people, well, the world leaders came together to talk about the climate crisis. But a little unknown fact about this is that prior to the gathering of state leaders under the UN, Indigenous peoples actually gathered the week before. Indigenous peoples and civil society, but largely Indigenous peoples, around 500 or so Indigenous peoples from all over the world. And they wrote what's called the Kia Ora Declaration. And they submitted it to the UN saying that they needed to have Indigenous peoples and civil society needed to have a voice within these spaces, and that we needed to protect Mother Earth and reconnect with her. And since 1992, they created, as a byproduct of that meeting, where lots of world leaders came to discuss climate change. There's a really famous speech of a young woman who's now not so young anymore. She's the same age as me, but Severin Suzuki, as the girl who stopped the world for like 12 minutes or something because of her impassioned speech around saving the planet. And she was a woman of color. She is a really great friend of mine now. But this was like the set off. And then they created the UN Forum Convention on Climate Change and agreed to start having annual meetings to find ways to address the global climate crisis together. And since that time, the first conference of the parties was held, I believe, in Berlin, Germany in 1995. And from the get-go, civil society and Indigenous peoples have always had counter summits or people summits, because it's just state leaders, colonial governments, all meeting to decide what happens with how they're going to tackle the climate crisis. But civil society said, we need a say. And so they began lobbying. They began asking folks, or like lobbying state leaders, being like, why are you putting forward this proposal? Or like, your proposal needs to have this language in it. And civil society throughout the years has had a huge impact on the negotiations that happens inside the official Conference of the Parties state negotiation spaces. Without civil society, and namely without Indigenous peoples, we would not be where we're at today, with having more progressive or fighting some of the more fascist and capitalist approaches that we're seeing emerge within these negotiations.
Thank you for that context. So just taking that history into account, what is happening at this year's conference? It's already being dubbed by the New York Times and different media outlets as humanity's most important like world conference or climate conference. Why are people saying that? And yeah, what's at stake this year? Why is it so important that we are attending, that we're organizing there?
Yeah, so first off, it's the Conference of the Party, or the Cop26, which means this is the 26th time that this group has met since 1995. And they still haven't figured out how to agree on the approaches from a global perspective for all the states to agree on what the approach should be to address the climate crisis. We all know that in 2015, well, not all, but in 2015, the historic Paris Agreement was agreed upon by the states. And this agreement set out a goal to keep global temperatures 1.5 degrees below pre-industrial levels. And it became historic because it's the first international declaration to recognize Indigenous peoples and the rights of Indigenous peoples since the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples from 2007. And so within this context, there's all of this agreement. Everyone's like, yeah, we got to address the climate crisis. But since that time, they've been negotiating what they call the Paris Rule Book. So all the articles, so there's all these articles of the Paris Agreement, and for each one, they're setting out the rules for achieving that goal. All but one article has been agreed upon, and it's Article 6. And within this article, it is to create an international mitigation mechanism. So what they're trying to do is figure out how the whole world can agree on counting their carbon emissions, reducing their carbon emissions, what strategies they can utilize to reduce those emissions, and how they can offset those emissions. And so this is where, if we don't come to an agreement, then we can't have a global framework, and everything kind of is just like a free-for-all. All one man, or everyone's for himself, not all men for himself. And some states don't want a mechanism where they're policed by this like one world sort of mechanism. But the reality is we have to all agree collectively as an entire planet on how to achieve keeping 1 degree below pre-industrial levels. And there has to be safeguards for human rights and the rights of Indigenous peoples. And we cannot be putting forward solutions that actually don't reduce emissions and bring us down to like a zero. We have to avoid language around net zero, which you might be hearing about, which is actually talking about offsetting. And so there's a whole problem within this Article 6 around the proposals for a whole suite or a whole bunch of false solutions. So solutions that don't actually reduce our emissions, but are just ways of accounting for kind of shuffling emissions around through what they call conservation or carbon offsets. And this is a huge problem for Indigenous peoples and human rights across the planet.
Yes, and I want to give you a break because you've been diving right in and going at it. So I'll just quickly just speak to why false solutions are that we, especially like our groups working with and for Indigenous communities, are so adamant against false solutions. So I would say, and please add on to this, is that it doesn't address the root cause of climate change, which is the fossil fuel industry or our fossil fuel economies. So the big ask, so the solution, I would say, to false solutions is keep it in the ground. So every time we say no false solutions or no to something, or stop something, we want to provide that. You know, what's the solution? It's keeping fossil fuels in the ground. It's investing direct investment into Indigenous communities to help self-determination when they build their own renewable or regenerative solutions, be that wind, solar, or whatever a community is wanting to determine as far as their path forward. Would you add anything else to that?
I mean, that's a really great articulation. I think that the reality is that we aren't just going there to say no to all the solutions that are being proposed, because we recognize that something needs to be done. But it's, what are we trying to save? And the conversations become a big debate. Are we saving the planet, or are we saving the economy? And a lot of time, like these petrostates are big oil and gas countries, really want to make sure that their economy is safeguarded in this transition to a clean energy economy or a reduction of emissions. But the reality is that we need to do better than that. Like, this isn't something where we can have like little incremental change. We need to have transformative shifts. That means like keep it in the ground, no more new approvals of any oil and gas projects globally. And there's a whole fossil fuel treaty that is being like put out into the world right now. There's all sorts of things that are happening. But also in addition to that, we also have to think about the fact that in the Paris Agreement, it recognized Indigenous peoples and Indigenous peoples' knowledge as critical to bringing forward the solutions to solve the crisis. But what we're seeing in these negotiations isn't this like Indigenous peoples being uplifted into positions of power and decision making. We're still relegated to the sidelines. We're still relegated to the civil society stakeholders discussions where we have to chase state colonial leaders around to try to get them to advance our issues or our concerns and submit our interventions within these forums, which are really critical to change. I don't want to diminish that work because it is important, but a lot of the times when it doesn't get heard, we resort to protest, to direct action, which has a huge history within the UN Forum Convention on Climate Change and the Conference of the Parties. This is the way that things have been working. Without these mobilizations of people, without Indigenous pushback, we would not be seeing the type of progress we have. We would already have a bunch of false solutions. And so people have been asking like what that is, but one of the big ones that's coming up right now is this appropriation or this regurgitation of Indigenous philosophy and values and cosmology of we need to listen to nature and Mother Earth has the solutions for us, but by colonial governments and capitalist corporations that are framing it as nature-based solutions, where they're then looking to grab up all the biodiversity in the world, and 80% of that biodiversity is there and exists within the hands and in the communities and the traditional territories of Indigenous peoples. 80% of the biodiversity of the world is because of Indigenous peoples, our lifeways, our cultures, our understandings, our relationships with those ecosystems. And now governments want to capitalize on that, corporations want to capitalize on that, and they're not doing it in a way that uplifts or honors that Indigenous peoples have those relationships, but only as a way to offset their emissions. And so this allows, let's say, a big oil and gas company, especially if we create a global mechanism, which they're trying to create under Article 6, this will allow, let's say, they're doing some, let's go to the UK. They have proposals of offshore drilling in Ireland and in Scotland, and they want to drill there. Those same companies, which is I think a Shell, can just go to the Amazon. They could go to northern Canada and the boreal forest, and they could purchase a conservation offset, which originally should belong to the Indigenous peoples, and then they will then own both this offset to offset their emissions here. But what happens to the Indigenous communities is they now have restrictions on how they can utilize these lands. Most of the time, this will result in limitations on their harvesting, limitations on their activities on those lands, because in order for those offsets to be counted, they have to increase the carbon sequestration, meaning they have to increase the biodiversity. And so that means they want to remove humans from the environment. And that is so counterintuitive to Indigenous peoples. It puts us at risk for new land grabs and neo-colonialism at its finest, rearing its head under a framework that it's for the betterment of the planet. This is for the betterment of corporations and capitalism, not the planet. If they were interested in saving the planet, they would keep fossil fuels in the ground. They would phase out of these dirty fossil fuel and energy projects, and they would look at ways to replicate Indigenous lifeways and lifestyles that are in harmony with ecosystems, not appropriating them for their own good.
Snap. Thanks, Eriel. You know, I heard you mention this piece around incremental change, and I know that there are a lot of people out there, especially Indigenous peoples, who from around the world, who are frustrated, so frustrated with how slowly the United Nations and the UNFCCC, at the pace they move and the pace that they create change. So you're someone who's been a part of these conferences for how many years? I don't want to guess.
First one was in 2009. I don't know how long ago that was. Like, that's like, I guess 12 years now. So 12 years.
12 years, yeah, you're a veteran. And so, and this will be my fourth cup, I believe, third or fourth, but, and I'm still learning so much. But as someone who's been a part of this process and has gone through seeing the build up to the Paris Agreement, and then, you know, the outcomes of the Paris Agreement, and then here we are, 2021, where we are in code red. We know this from the IPCC report that was released in August. Really, we have this very small window as humanity to be able to survive. Like, we're at that point where it's, you know, ecological collapse, famine, and civilization really coming to a place of collapse, or we have an opportunity to reimagine, you know, our priorities and how our systems work, and abandoning, you know, capitalistic models that have gotten us into this problem. So so my question is, why do you keep showing up in these spaces? You've mentioned that there has been progress made. Maybe you can talk about what that progress is, because I really want folks to understand that, you know, people like yourself are doing critical work in these spaces, and we can't erase it. We have to amplify it. And also, just I'm curious, why do you personally keep showing up in this space?
It's a really good question, and I get asked it a lot because they're like, is the UN really doing anything? Yes and no, right? The answer is yes and no. It's been super slow, but there are mechanisms or levers. I call them levers. We're going to these spaces to create levers for our communities. The Paris Agreement became a lever when it had the language to acknowledge and recognize Indigenous rights, and the knowledge, Indigenous knowledge, is critical. This became a lever in our countries to challenge governments when they were creating climate policies. You know, when they were declaring climate emergencies, suddenly our own communities were empowered to do that ourselves, to intervene and state there is an international agreement that you signed on to that acknowledges us as critical to developing climate policy, to developing, to utilizing our knowledge to inform as a best practice for creating those policies. And suddenly our knowledge systems in our communities are now being seen on a higher level, that our knowledge systems that are intergenerational, that have the longest scientific data sets that exist on the planet because of our relationships, and also the ways in which we transmit through both experiential and storytelling to transmit our knowledge, has provided critical information on understanding ecosystems for us to better adapt and for us to better mitigate the situations. And this is super critical. And that lever, and that having Indigenous knowledge included in the Paris Agreement, didn't come because some colonial government wanted it there. It came from decades of work of Indigenous peoples advocating and fighting for that. And so this is a critical piece that if we didn't have that, we would not have that lever here now. In addition, having standards of agreements of keeping temperatures 1.5 degrees below industrial levels allows people in our own communities to push on our governments, whether they're municipal, you know, like provincial or your state level, or like the national level. We're able to push back on our governments continually. And as far as the Indigenous rights models go, we are pushing into new frontiers. There is currently a body under the UNFCCC, the UN Forum Convention on Climate Change, called the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples Platform, that are trying to create standards for the inclusion of Indigenous knowledge and for understanding and implementing Indigenous rights frameworks into the agreements across the Paris rulebook, and also to ensure that our communities are not just appropriated, that we're not just being told, like, give us your knowledge so that we can digest it and turn it into nature-based solutions. They're fighting to ensure that that doesn't happen. Without that work, what would happen? What would these spaces look like? These spaces, without the hard work of civil society and Indigenous peoples, would be just capitalist solutions, colonial solutions that would not care about land grabs, would not care about keeping fossil fuels in the ground, would not care about any of this stuff, because they would be primarily focused on capitalist solutions. And there is a history of this. The first agreement, the Kyoto Agreement, signed in 1996, I believe it was, or 97, they created something called the Clean Development Mechanism. And it was the first program to look at creating a cap and trade or a carbon trading mechanism. And they said, oh, it's going to work. This is going to save the planet. We'll just do this whole thing. Since 1997, global emissions have increased, not decreased, and capitalism has run amok. These corporations are violating human rights and Indigenous rights all over the place. And this isn't just about keeping carbon in the atmosphere. This is about protecting our forests and our ancestors, about protecting species, because we're seeing millions of species disappear, not just from climate change, but from the disruption of our ecosystems, from these really big, bad, ugly capitalist extractivist organizations and corporations. We're seeing the contamination of our water systems. We're in a water crisis. We're in a crisis of epic proportions: food crisis, water crisis, species crisis. And it's not going to stop unless we address those root causes. And those root causes come from colonialism, capitalism, patriarchy, and extractivism. And Indigenous peoples have been fighting those systems from the day colonization started. From day one, we have been fighting against colonialism and the extractivism from our lands and territories. And unless we address those root causes, we're not going to win this battle. And that will take a transformative shift of our minds, our spirits, and our bodies, and our entire systems that we currently live in.
100%. I couldn't agree more. And I know that we are coming up to our time, and you have places to be and systems to smash. And so I'm really fired up. I can't wait for you to touch down on the ground and to be joining you and your team in this work, which is really, at the root of it is to, like you said, is to protect our identities, our cultures, which is so interdependent and interconnected with the land and the waters, as well as the climate, because without a healthy climate, all of that stuff is very much at risk. I wanted to ask one final question. So our brains often, this is me putting my communications hat on, our brains often digest things in threes. So all the people who are here, we acknowledge that, there needs to be more representation. There needs to be more equity at COP. And we wish we could bring all of our communities here, but we're in a pandemic and it's really challenging. We had to make some really hard decisions in organizing and getting here. We really want to work with our folks who are back home, all of you who are on this live, all of you who follow NDN Collective, who follow ICA, we want to, work with you, our audiences, to amplify these messages. And so back to the thing about our brains and thinking in threes, what are 3 top line messages that you would want our audiences here to share over the course of COP from November 1st to November 12th?
Yeah, I think I just want to say thank you for articulating that. Like, being in the pandemic, like, we're not going lightly. Making the decision to go is because we know that if we don't go, and there are so many people that can't go, particularly from like red listed countries and developing nations where they don't have equal access to the vaccine to be able to travel and to be able to afford quarantines and all those restrictions. So those that can go, that are a part of civil society, need to be louder. And we had made calls to cancel the COP because of that, but because they're not doing that, we have to show up. We have to show up to disrupt. We have to show up to be like, this is an unfair, inaccessible process. So the 3 messages are: no false solutions. We can't afford false solutions. Keep it in the ground. keep fossil fuels in the ground, and respect Indigenous rights. These are the three easy messages that we, again, no false solutions. That means no carbon trading, no nature-based solutions, no mini nuclear reactors, nothing that supports extractivism and the ongoing colonialism and capitalism and fossil fuel industry. Anything that keeps those core root causes alive, we can't afford them. So no false solutions. Keep fossil fuels in the ground. And lastly, respect Indigenous rights. We have the answers and the solutions. We need to be empowered to be able to make decisions that are best for our communities, our lands, our territories. And in that framework, land back, water back, everything back.
Yes. And yeah, respect and integrate FPIC, free, prior, informed consent, respect self-determination, just to add to that umbrella of Indigenous rights. But thank you so much, Eriel. I am going to let you go. Thank you, everyone who joined. We'll be here. We'll be on the ground, live streaming from both channels. We'll be working in partnership, in coalition with Indigenous Environmental Network, with Native Movement from Alaska, and also partnering with some of our global Indigenous relatives, showing up in that way, building Indigenous solidarity. So yeah, that kind of cohort of groups, just follow along, amplify our work, and yeah, wish us luck.
Wish us all the luck, everyone. So put your prayers down, smudge for us, because we're going into a pretty wild space. And
we do need that medicine sent our way. Yeah, it could not be more important. As we said, this is the climate conferences of all climate conferences, and or the climate conference of all climate conferences, and we have to get it right this time. So with that, we'll end, but we'll be back soon with more content and more lives and more storytelling. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Masicho. Bye-bye.